Hello again, grade 12s. So now I'm carrying on with part 2 of my terminology relating to genetics. So as a reminder, in part 1, the terminology that I went through was genetics itself. We talked about the gene, alleles, the different versions of a gene, locus, the location of a gene, genome, all the genes that you have inherited as an individual, and then the gene pool, looking at you as a society, as a population, all the alleles or the genes that are available for you to potentially create an offspring with. But now what we're going to do in part 2 is we're going to really only focus on when we're dealing with one trait, one characteristic. So as opposed to all the genes that you've inherited, all the different versions, we're focusing on one trait and the different terminology related to that. So the first set of terms we need to understand is genotype versus phenotype. So remember, we as animals, we are sexually reproducing animals. You are going to inherit one set of genes from your mother, or one set, or the one allele is going to come from your mother, and the other set of genes, the other allele, when I'm dealing with one trait, comes from your father. So you are only ever going to inherit two alleles of a particular gene in one person. So, for example, if I use eye color, you are only ever going to have two alleles. You can't have more than that because you inherited one from your mother, one from your father. Although there might be a multitude of other different alleles that are out there, you only inherit two. Whether they're the same or whether they are different is a different story, but you will inherit two of them. So therefore, your genotype refers to the genetic composition of an individual for one trait. So let's take eye color for an example, and the question I will ask myself is, which specific alleles have I inherited regarding eye color? It might be that I have brown and black. Those are the two genes. I might have brown and blue. I might have blue and blue. They could be the same. But what are the specific alleles? That is the genotype that we refer to. And the way that we represent the genotype is with letters. So much like in maths, we use letters as variables, basically. We assign a particular letter to represent one type of gene. And because we've only have two types of alleles, we're either only going to have the same alleles, or we're going to have different ones. So the way that we represent it is we choose a letter, and the way that we represent the two versions is either with a capital letter for one version, or a lowercase letter for another version. We'll get more into the interaction of that a little bit later. But because you're only inheriting two, we keep the same letter. We don't change letters, because remember, one letter represents one version. So if we change the letters, it's two completely different genes we're looking at. So it's just capital letters and lowercase letters, because it's only two that we're looking at. Now that's the genotype, the two alleles. But what is it that you actually look like? So if you go and look in the mirror, look at your eye color. What color do you see? Do you see both of the alleles that you have inherited? No. You only see what is actually being expressed, what is being coded for in the end. It doesn't matter which two you have. You are seeing that you have brown eyes, for example. You are seeing that you have green eyes, for example. So that is the phenotype. So phenotype refers to the outward physical expression of the inherited genes. The question you would then ask yourself, look in the mirror or look at a person, what does the person look like on the outside, the expression of the gene? So again, you may have inherited two different versions or the same, it doesn't matter. Phenotype refers to what is the physical outward expression. Now, also bear in mind, as much as we're talking about physical things, a lot of the stuff that we do in genetics relates to disorders. So, functioning and non-functioning. So, we can also describe phenotype as being normal versus affected. And again, normal is very inverted commas. It's just the word that we use to describe this. So normally, or what we're talking about in terms of genotype here, when we've got normal versus affected, is the alleles would be functioning and non-functioning. So that is that. Okay, so that is genotype and phenotype. Then we move on. Here's an example of genotype versus phenotype. I'm going to use an example of a widow's peak. So a widow's peak is something, if you haven't seen it before, it's like with your hairline, at the top of your hairline on your forehead. If it creates a characteristic M shape, if there's an M shape, that is a widow's peak, so the peak coming in the middle, versus a straight hairline where there is no peak, there's no coming in the front. You'll see a picture in just in a second. So I'm going to assign the letter W, capital W, to represent the allele or the version for a widow's peak. I'm going to use a lowercase w to represent a straight hairline. So these are the variables that I'm using. I'm then going to let them represent the two different versions. W is not the best one to use, but you'll see why I just use it for the picture that's coming up. But remember, we are now genotype. I get one from my mother and one from my father. So what are the potential genotypes that I can inherit? If I only get one from my mother and one from my father, these are the only two that I care about. What are the potential genotypes? Well, there are only three versions I can have. It is either going to be both capital W, or a capital W and little w, or lowercase w, both of them together. Those are the only three potential combinations that I can have. There's nothing else different. There's nothing else that I can have. Those are the only three, because remember, I'm only dealing with two alleles. I can only inherit two. What then is going to be the phenotype of these different ones? So here's the picture example so you can see. So if you are a big W, or big W, little w, that is going to be a widow's peak phenotype. So this is the little M that gets created here. So if you have this genotype or this genotype, you will have a widow's peak. If you have little w for the straight hairline, you will then have a straight hairline. So the genotype is this, the letters. The phenotype is then, what do you look like? You either have a widow's peak or you don't have a widow's peak. I know some of you are kind of saying, well, why is it that these two create this and that? Just hold on to that thought for 2 seconds. We're going to be getting to it. Just understand, genotype is then the letters. What have you physically inherited? Phenotype, what is the outward physical expression of this combination of alleles? Okay, that's the first one. Second difference we need to know. Heterozygous versus homozygous. So, big words, I know. Let's break them down. First of all, what does zygous mean? So the suffix zygous in this instance, the 3 dots, is going to be a word that we put in here, but zygous refers to the phrase types of alleles. So that's what zygous means. Hetero and homo is then going to dictate what word is going to be placed in these 3 dots, but zygous means types of alleles. So let me take you back to our example that we had in our previous picture. We had said that the possible genotypes that we can have will either be big, 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 small, or small, small. Do we notice that big W, and little w, in those instances, that individual has inherited the same allele? So it's essentially saying widow's peak, straight hairline, straight hairline. They are both the same. The versions are exactly the same. We therefore refer to this as homozygous. Homo being the same. So if we were to put the words, we'd say the same types of alleles. So these are the same types of alleles, which is, it's capital letter, and small letter. Homozygous. The opposite of this being, we look at the one that is big capital W and small letter w. These are different alleles. They are not the same. It's a capital and a lowercase. Yes, it's the same W, but the versions are different. This is therefore heterozygous. Hetero being different, the prefix for different. So we are saying different types of alleles. So we've got the same versions and different. So let's just solidify that. Homozygous is therefore someone who has inherited the same alleles for a gene, the same versions of the gene. Heterozygous is then having inherited different alleles or different versions of a gene. Okay, so that's a very important difference that we have, heterozygous and homozygous. Remember, it's only two versions that we have. It's only two. It's not all the different multitude. It's only those two. Are they the same, capital and little letter, or are they different, capital, little letter, or are they the same, big letter, small letter? Okay. Now, there's still some of you are saying, why is it that we had the one where it was a big letter and a little letter, but it was still a widow's peak? Well, now we come to the last difference that we need to understand, which is that being dominant and recessive alleles. Okay. So the name kind of really sort of suggests what we have here. So I'm just going to take you back to the example. We had said the example is that a capital W represents widow's peak and a little w represents a straight hairline. So clearly, if you had inherited both the same widow's peak and widow's peak, there's no debate about it. You are only going to have a widow's peak. So if they're both the same, it will be a widow's peak. In the same way that if we have a small letter, straight line, straight hairline, you are only going to have a straight hairline. There's no debate. There's no anything about it. That's what it's going to be. The issue comes when you have a heterozygous combination. I've got two different versions. So which one is going to win out the war between what is going to be expressed in the phenotype? So I have told you here that in this instance, if you have big W, little w, you will have a widow's peak. So in this instance, this has covered, or it has cancelled out the effect of the little one. So in this instance, a widow's peak is then dominant over a straight hairline. So, dominant genes will mask the recessive allele. So it will cover it. It will cancel it out. It will not delete it. It will make it sure it doesn't work, kind of thing. It will be expressed in the phenotype if it is present in your genotype. So if we look at the previous one, if it was big W, yes, you had a widow's peak. If it was big W, little w, even if there was only one of them present, if it is there, it will be expressed. That is then the dominant one. And a bit more of a more scientific explanation is that it can be expressed both homozygously or heterozygously. So just another way that we use these words here. So if you were asked to define what is the dominant allele, what does it mean to be dominant, you can use all three of these definition terms or ways of describing them. Learn them. Know how to use them. The opposite then is obviously talking about recessive. Recessive alleles will be masked by the dominant allele. So will mask the recessive will be masked by the dominant. It will be cancelled out. It will not be able to be expressed. And therefore, the scientific way is saying that it can only be expressed homozygously. Only if you inherit both alleles as being recessive will it be expressed in the phenotype. So only if it's little letter, or whichever one is the recessive one. Only if it's both of them will you have the recessive trait. Okay, so what we've mainly done in this video, we've done genotype versus phenotype, we've done heterozygous versus homozygous, and now we've done dominant versus recessive alleles. The last thing, and I'm just going to do it very quickly, is what is a hybrid? So a hybrid is a combination of two different species, obviously ones that can actually mate with each other, or varieties to create offspring with mixed traits. So yes, some people are saying to me, no, but a species is one that can only mate with each other. When I look at species of birds, for example. So the one I'm going to use here is, let's have two different types of crow, a carrion crow and a hooded crow. Although they are two different species, or versions of this, they are still able to create a hybrid. Much in the same way that, you have a horse and a donkey creating a mule, they are still able to create that. But mainly we focus on hybrids of the different varieties that we focus on. So more like the different versions of a gene. So if I take a purebred version of a flower with one color, still on the same type of plant, and I take a purebred version of another type of plant with the same flower but a different color, and I then mate those two together, I have created a hybrid because they've got the two different versions of the color, but they're purebred. So they're both homozygous. If I take homozygous one and homozygous of another and I put them together, I will create a hybrid. So basically it's just two separate individuals that I am mating together. That's really what hybrid is. Okay, so that's the end of terminology. So, as a summary, these are all the terms that you need to know in depth. You need to be able to define. You need to be able to explain in your own words. You need to know how they relate to each other. So you really have to have a good understanding of all these terms before we move forward into talking about the history, and then going into the applied nature of genetics and even genetic engineering. You need to have an understanding of these words. Okay, so go back to part 1, go through each of them. Go to part 2, make sure you understand each of these in depth, make sure you go through this. Hope you enjoyed the video, guys. Again, if you have questions, hit me up on the Skype panel, get me on Teams, let's have a meeting. I really want to make sure that you understand specifically this very complicated section of work that we're going through. Keep up the hard studying, guys. Make sure that you go through things properly, and I really do appreciate the hard work, and thanks very much for watching the video, guys.